Knoxville Regionals is this week. I guess technically it is Sunday, so it's later this week. And if you don't know what you're playing, either actually playing to the tournament or what you can expect to play against, this video is for you. Hey, Nick from 9Card TCG, and today we're going to be looking at not only the meta share for the top 10 decks, but we're also going to be looking at matchup data for those decks, so we can talk about what decks have the best matchup spread into the current top 10, and maybe if you haven't already picked a deck, you can make a decision based on this, or you can get a better, deeper understanding of what your deck what it struggles against and what it does well against. Keep in mind, this is not definitive by any means. We're talking about win percents, and of course, there's never any guarantee. It all depends on how well you draw and how well your opponent draws, and not making mistakes, playing optimally, all that kind of stuff. So use this as more of a guide and not a definitive, this is the best deck, XYZ type of thing. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, all that kind of stuff. Tells YouTube this is a good channel. Other people should watch it. I do want to make one other quick disclaimer, if you will, in that just because you don't see a deck on this top 10 doesn't mean it can't do well, doesn't mean that you won't do well with it. It just means that in terms of popularity or number of points that, and you'll see number of points that you've gotten at a regional or a deck that has accumulated over different events, doesn't mean it can't be good, right? It just means it's just not in the top 10. But anyway, I digress. It's not really a digression. Like I said, I was gonna do a disclaimer. There's your disclaimer, and let's just get right into the video. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, understand what are the top 10 decks, and you can see we are first using the limitlesstcg.com data, and this is for the past month at regionals in standard format. So if you're wondering where this data came from, there you go. You can see the filters at the top of the page. Now, obviously, and it should not be a surprise to anybody who has or wants to play competitive Pokemon, Lugia is the most popular deck. According to Limitless, it has a 39% share of the meta, which is crazy. One of the things to note is that the number of points a deck has, and then the percent share that a deck has, is linked to a degree, right? The more people play a deck, the more likely it is to get points just because of sheer volume. But Lugia, at the same time, decks that get points tend to be played a lot, and it kind of feeds into each other. So Lugia is a very good deck. It's very strong, very powerful, and it's not a surprise that it's almost 40% of the meta. And there we go. The next highest deck on this list is Mew Vmax at not even 14%. We're at about 13.5%. Lost Zone Goodra, Lost Zone Rayquaza, Regis. We got a few single prize decks, or mostly single prize decks. Then we go back into Arceus Duraludon before going into more single prize decks with Lost Zone box. And I did separate out the different archetypes for this. If you mash all the different Lost Zone decks together, it'll be higher than Mew, but individually they're not. Now, the reason I wanted to show them separate is because they play differently. Lost Zone Goodra and Lost Zone Rayquaza are different decks, at least different enough that they're going to play differently, and your strategy might be different against them. So you can see we go back into Lost Zone Box, Yveltal Control, a Vikavolt V deck, and then we have Arceus Flying Pikachu, probably with something else, whether that's Duraludon, Hisuian Decidueye, some type of Dark Attacker, whatever it is. You got the Arceus Flying Pikachu. So top 10 points and share, they are connected. The top 10 in points is also the same exact top 10 in share. So there you go on that. But now we're going to look at the top 10 from this list in Trainer Hill data and see how they actually do against one another and why some matchups might be the way they are. So here we are, Trainer Hill, and my stupid face kind of cuts off some of the filters that we're using to look at this data, but I'll read it to you. This is standard format, regionals of 256 players or more, which is almost all of them. I think only the Australia ones don't hit that number. This is from starting at the beginning of the year. So from January 1st, 2023 to today, February 16th, 2023. And this is all run by all organizers. So there you go. So let's take a look at some of this data. We're going to start, this is listed alphabetically, going from top down and from left to right. So it's not ranking, it's not percent meta share, it's just alphabetical top to bottom. And if you notice, this diagonal, right, it's where the decks meet. Arceus Duraludon's going to have a 50% matchup into Arceus Duraludon. Lost Zone Goodra's going to have a 50% into Lost Zone Goodra. So this entire diagonal is mirror matches, and it should be 50-50. Another thing that's worth noting is just because a deck is favored or unfavored does not mean it can or can't win against a particular deck. It just means that you have a lower chance of winning based on historical records. And that's all it is. We're only looking at what has happened, not what will happen. Anyway, let's get into it. Arceus Duraludon here, obviously into the mirror, it is a 50%. So we're going to skip over all the mirrors. It loses to Lost Zone Goodra, which is really, really interesting because Goodra wants to tank damage, right? It takes 80 less damage from attacks after using Wrong Iron. But Arceus Duraludon's the Gmax pulverization ignores the damage decrease from the Goodra. So you would think that by having a shred attack, it would beat Goodra, but it just doesn't. Whether you're constantly being softened up by things like Cramorants and Sableye and things like that, and then the Goodra comes in, hits you really hard. Maybe you don't one-shot the Goodra and they constantly heal. They used the Moisture Star to completely heal all damage. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Maybe you just don't set up Goodra. You know, something like an Arceus Duraludon, if you don't set up, you're probably going to lose. Like if you don't get past that first 2 turns, maybe turn 3, you're probably going to lose that game. Where something like a Goodra can survive longer, even after not having the setup at once, because you're using all these single prize Pokemon. Your Comfeys are going to help you dig through the deck. Your Cramorants are going to let you poke at things here and there. So you have a little bit more opportunity to recover from a bad start with Goodra than you do Arceus. And Arceus Duraludon is probably the least forgiving in terms of if you fail to set up in 2-3 turns, you're going to lose that game almost every time. Another deck that you don't do well against is Rayquaza Lost Zone Ray, because Rayquaza is a single prize Pokemon that can one-shot your Duraludon. They don't need to turn off the ability. They don't need to worry about really anything. They just one-shot you, and that can be really, really scary. So Lost Zone Rayquaza, it makes sense why you lose. The only other matchup that you're unfavored against is Mew, and that's just more of, can I set up and heal, or will Mew just kind of get all of their power tablets and their choice belt and hit with Melodious Echo for 300 damage really, really quickly, because that's something Mew can do, or can I kind of outlast them, force them to discard a couple power tablets, use 1 or 2, not get to use all of them, and then I heal with, Crystal Caves and Hyper Potions and things like that. So you are unfavored, but it's not unwinnable. And if you add a Drapion, it makes it that much easier. So, and that's something that I've started doing in my my Arceus Duraludon deck, is include a Drapion for the Mew matchup, because it's a pretty easy inclusion to have, and it just helps that much. And Mew is something that you're probably going to run into, so worth noting. Everything else you are pretty favored against. You're favored into regular Lost Zone box decks because they just don't have the power to do enough damage to your Duraludons, especially between the healing. Getting through 2 Duraludons is really difficult, and if you could force them into an 8-prize game between the Duraludon and Arceus Vstar and another Duraludon, it's going to be really, really difficult. You are constantly knocking everything out, because the most HP a Pokemon's going to have is like 210, right? If they have like a Raikou V that has like 200 or 210 health, and Gmax Pulverization will one-shot everything in that deck. So it can go through anything because if it's a shred attack. You're pretty split into Lugia, Archeops. Again, it's one of those things that, can Lugia deal with your ability faster than you can just start piling up damage on all their Lugias? Lugia runs solely special energy. So if if they don't have a way to turn off the what's it called, the skyscraper ability, they're not going to be able to hit you. Yeah, maybe they can get a knockout with your Yveltal, but you're probably going to come back and counter KO, and that might be the only KO they get. So if you can deal with the Yveltal before they get a KO on your one and only Duraludon, you're okay. If you have two Duraludons in play and there's no more Yveltal, you're golden. You're probably going to win that. I just realized that I had Palkia on this list when I shouldn't have. It should have been the Arceus Flying Pikachu. Duraludon usually is going to beat that. So cool. Arceus Flying Pikachu is interesting. You have some pretty split matchups in the sense of there are a couple of decks that you do well against and there's some that you don't. You're going to lose to Arceus Duraludon. You're going to lose to Lugia. Losing to Lugia is really, really bad. Remember, 34 is roughly the inverse of 66. So, you're going to lose 2 out of 3 games. That's really, really bad in a best of 3 scenario against the best deck in the game. You hate to see it. But you're good against Goodra, you're good against Regis, you're good against Control. You probably won't see too much Control, so I wouldn't really worry. Like, if you lose to Control, like you're like a Mew deck and you lose to Control or Regis, I wouldn't really worry about it too much, but I would definitely worry about losing to something like Lugia. But you have some pretty split matchups. You're favored in the Lost Zone, you're favored in the Mew, you're favored in the Lost Box Ray. We don't know about Vikavolt. So, Arceus Flying Pikachu is one of those decks that maybe it does well, maybe it doesn't. Can you get lucky on starting Arceus? Can you go first, get the Arceus, get an energy, and just kind of get things going? Who's the second partner? You have Arceus Flying Pikachu and what? Espeon. Are you running like an Arceus Flying Pikachu counter box with Espeon and Drapion and what's it called? There's a bunch of stuff in there. Aerodactyl and Empoleon. You have like so many things. Or are you running like Arceus Flying Pikachu, Hisuian Decidueye? I don't really know. So it really depends on how you're running the Arceus Flying Pikachu and kind of what you hit. Have to get a little bit lucky. Goodra is pretty good as well. I mean, you're losing real hard to Arceus Flying Pikachu for some reason. I don't really know why. I guess because the Flying Pikachu makes it really hard for the deck to function. And then the Goodra, you just kind of have to get through the Goodra. But all of your single prize Pokemon, all your basic Pokemon can't attack the Flying Pikachu. So that can be kind of annoying. And you're not going to one-shot them. So they have an opportunity to two-shot your Goodra. And then you're never going to be able to finish cleaning up something with a Cramorant or anything like that. And if they play a big Parasol, which they should, the Sableye becomes really difficult to use as well. So that's probably why. But some of the other stuff that you lose against is Lugia. Again, taking a loss to Lugia is not a good thing. But aside from Arceus Flying Pikachu and Goodra, and Lugia, I mean, Goodra does pretty well against everything else. So maybe you can get kind of lucky and dodge some Lugias, but oh boy, I would not bank on it. Lost Zone Box has a pretty lackluster matchup spread. I mean, you're pretty unfavored into everything except for Lost Zone Ray and Yveltal Control, which Lost Zone Ray is a good deck and it's pretty popular and something that I would definitely consider the matchup against, but I would not care about Control, at least enough, right? The odds of you hitting the handful of Control players are really low, so not really impressed with Lost Zone Box. And then, of course, Lugia, again, oddly enough, pretty neutral matchups when you look at it. The things you're best against are Goodra and Arceus Flying Pikachu. You're slightly favored into some other things like some of the Lost Zone decks. You lose most of the time to something like a Vikavolt because if they get that item lock, you're not going to be able to play your Evolution Incense and Ultra Balls to get those Archeops into the discard. You're also weak to Lightning. That could be kind of a problem. If you're not able to Quick Ball or Ultra Ball for your Dunsparce, then they're going to be hitting you for weakness constantly, so that could be really, really challenging. And you lose to Control, but again, I'm not really going to care about this too much. For a deck that is so good, and this is where I said before that sheer numbers is what's going to get this deck points. Yes, it has done really well. If it's won 2 regionals, if I remember correctly, so it has really good potential, but just so many people playing it is going to put this deck in the top spot as far as points. But in reality, the matchup spread is nothing really great. But I still think being neutral or slightly favored into everything is actually good, because you don't really take any super hard losses and you have a chance to win against everything, and I do value that a lot. Mew Genesect is another deck that just is good against most things. The thing you're worst against is Lost Zone Ray. Again, you don't really handle a lot of single prize decks too well. You're slightly unfavored against Regis. You don't do well at all against Control. The Lost Zone box, you're slightly 51%, 52% is pretty neutral. The slightest thing goes wrong and you lose, or the slightest thing goes right and you win. Like it's pretty neutral, those games. It's just the Rayquaza, because again, they have the ability to knock out those 3 prize Vmaxes very, very easily. So, but again, if you're good with Mew, and this is true for everything, if you have a deck that is like slightly favored to some things, slightly unfavored to others, it's fairly neutral across the board, and you're good with that deck, you will likely do well with it, because you have a chance to beat it. You have a good chance to beat everything, a fair chance to beat everything you might encounter, and you know how to pilot the deck, which matters a ton. So just because a deck, like, you look at this and you're like, oh my goodness, Arceus Duraludon has like one of the better matchup spreads, or Goodra has one of the better matchup spreads, so I had to start playing Goodra. I gotta drop playing Mew, even though I've been playing it for the past over a year. I'm going to drop Mew to start playing Goodra and totally learn that deck and how to play it. That might not be the best plan of action. Playing Mew may be the better plan. Even though it might have a slightly worse matchup spread, you know how to maximize the chances of winning by being good and comfortable with the deck. So that also matters a ton. Lost Zone Ray is really, oh boy, surprising. You don't do well against some of the other single prize decks. You don't do well against Lost Zone Box. You don't do well against Regis. You're obviously split into yourself. The few games that you've played against Yveltal Control, you haven't won. You're going to do terrible against Vikavolt. Even something like Arceus Flying Pikachu, again, they get the Pikachu. It doesn't matter how much damage Rayquaza can do if you can't attack the Flying Pikachu because of Max Balloon. So the things that you do well against are big 3 prize Pokemon, Arceus, Duraludon, Mew, and you're slightly unfavored into Lugia, because they also can attack with single prize Pokemon. They can offset that prize trade, so you're not trading up constantly. You're dealing with your Yveltal, you're dealing with Radiant Charizard, you're dealing with the Arceus, and you have to contend with that Stoutland potentially very early game, which can be really problematic. And it's one of the reasons that you're going to lose is because of Stoutland. So hopefully Stoutland's prized. Maybe they can't get it out in time. Maybe they have some of those powerful colorless energies prized. Whatever it is, Stoutland can be a huge problem, and it's one that you have to really, really look out for. Moving on to Regis. Again, it's another deck that just has some pretty there's a word I'm thinking of and I can't remember what it is. You have some like polarized matchups. Some are really good and some are really bad. Your Arceus Duraludon, your Arceus Pikachu, your Lost Zone Goodra, Yveltal Control, really bad, and then you have some good ones against Lugia, against Lost Zone Rayquaza, and then your favorite or equal with everything else. Vikavolt, and this is worth noting, like some of these games, 15 games played. It's not a huge data set versus something like 62 with like Lugia. 62 is probably the thing you have the most against. Yeah. So 62 games played against Lugia versus the 4 games played against Arceus Flying Pikachu does matter in terms of how valid the data is, how powerful. In statistics we use the term power to describe like just like the validity of data almost. And there is a huge difference between 62 and 4. So the higher the number, the more games have been played against each other, like Lugia mirrors. There's been 388 Lugia mirrors that have been reported. That's a lot of games. And yes, I know it's a mirror, so we can, I'm just trying to look real quick, like 113 games, Lost Zone Box against Lugia. Like we can believe that number of 46% because so many games have been recorded. I'm sure Mew Lugia has 153. Yeah, it's like, so some of these numbers we really can trust, whereas some of them 6 and 2, this is a mirror, so it doesn't really count, but like 5, you know, you have to take that into consideration as well. But anyway, Vikavolt, yeah, it's actually not bad. Losing to Goodra and losing to Arceus Duraludon, yeah, you're going to lose to Mewtwo because, or Mew as well, I don't want to say Mewtwo. Mew, also losing to Mew is not great, but beating Archeops, beating some of the Lost Zone decks, pretty good. And you split with some of these other single prize decks that might be problematic. Regis has a fighting type in the form of Regirock, so they can easily one-shot your Vikavolts. That could be a little challenging. And then Yveltal Control. You really gotta know how to play this thing. Oh my god. I mean, there's one game against Arceus Flying Pikachu, so like that, is it really 0? I mean, it's been one game and they just lost. If you play another 10 games, what's the win percent? So this is what I'm talking about. You're not just relying on this data as be-all, end-all, but this one game was a loss for Yveltal Control. Starburst is really annoying. Being able to accelerate energies can be really annoying for something like a control deck to do. So if you manage your energies well, it might be, I could see why the control deck would lose. I also see why they lose to Arceus Duraludon, because if they're relying on using like mill tanks and things that can't be hit by Vs, Arceus Duraludon just kind of shreds right through it. Single prize Pokemon, again, aren't affected by something like a mill tank, so a Cramorant can easily one-shot a mill tank. Same thing here. And then you win against everything else, right? You just kind of have to get through some of these Lost Zone decks and then like some of these Vmaxes. But you're pretty good against everything else if you can establish your loop. And this is, again, where it comes into really understanding how to play your deck. Are you comfortable with it? Do you understand the matchups? And do you know the counts? Like with the number of copies that decks tend to play, which cards, things like that. So for a little while, you can get away with playing against Lugia Archeops and doing better because they didn't really run any switches. And now Lugias tend to run some type of switch out, whether it's like an actual switch, an escape rope, a bird keeper, something like that. So now you can't rely on paralyzing or trapping as easily because there are those switch outs, and that was maybe not so much a control thing. Things like the Frostmoth water box with the Articuno that paralyzed kind of forces Lugia to play some type of switch outs, and that indirectly hurts something like Control that wants to trap and do all these things. So some decks do get screwed over a little bit because of techs that other decks force you to play, and now you have to contend with that. So knowing exactly what to expect, what decks play, how many copies of particular things that affect your win condition is super important for Control. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't play it, because it's very, very challenging to know all this, remember it, and then be able to execute it in the game when maybe something you need is prized and things don't go your way and you're not drawing what you want. It can be very, very challenging, and I give a lot of credit to people who can play Control well, consistently. Ton of credit. Matchup data, all that kind of stuff. I hope it helps you prepare for Knoxville, whether, like I said, that's choosing a deck to play or understanding what decks people might bring and the ones that you should be on the lookout for, things that maybe you need to either tech for or not. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions or if you have any comments about what we went over. I really enjoy doing these videos because I think it is super helpful. At least I hope it is. And yeah, let me know what your thoughts in the comments. But that's going to do it for us today. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.